we're going to do a quick run through on the evolution of molt. This talk will mostly be about molt terminology. There's lots of other exciting things going on in the worlds of bird molt right now. And actually, let's see here. Okay. This will be a kind of a rehash of a talk I gave back in December to the Birds of the World group. And that URL is at the bottom. Guarantee when I give these molt talks, I don't say the same thing. I ad-lib the whole way. So whatever pops in my brain, I start talking about. So this will that talk there, if you want to look at that, will be similar to this one, but we'll have a lot of different things as well. And I think Meredith's going to put the URL down there into the chat if you want to grab that. Okay, let's start here. What is a molt? Okay, it's not just, we think of a molt as bird molt as dropping of feathers, but that's not all. It's kind of part of a whole body reorganization, restoration process, and it's part of an endogenous metabolism or an alteration of whole body protein metabolism. So when a bird's in heavy molt, it's not just dropping feathers, it's going through a big process, which birds go through once a year. Mammals do too, and it's probably part of something that birds has evolved over the years from when birds evolved from reptiles. So it's molt is not just something birds came up with recently to change their feathers. It's part of a bigger process than that. So when I got started, and back in sort of the 80s, 70s, and 80s, there were all these terms for molt, and the whole subject seemed to be clouded by the fact that there were just too many terms. And these are my old slides I used to give about how ornithologists approach the study of molt. It was like, so many terms, so confusing that most students went into, say, breeding systems or migration or something like that instead. So for this reason, I think, is a big part of the reason why the study of avian molt lags behind that of other topics, such as breeding and migration in birds. And another reason molt kind of lags behind is that the original bird collectors in the late 19th and early 20th century primarily collected birds that were in good fresh plumage, and they like to go out in October, November, right after the molt. But none of them really wanted to collect birds in molt. They look terrible, and they're hard to prepare, and there's flaky skin all over the place. So they kind of avoided collecting birds. So here I am at Cal Academy of Sciences, and there's over 100,000, or is it 1 million specimens here, and just about probably 2% were collected while the birds were in molt. So there's not a lot there to kind of study molt with. So the original terminology that people like to use for molt is called the life cycle terminology, and it's what I grew up with. It's what most of us who've been in this game for a while grew up with. And here are some of the terms highlighted in red. And you can see that the terms have a lot to do with the yearly cycle. They relate to when birds breed. Some of them are summer, winter, and so forth. So that's a terminology that, in fact, works really well in the Northern Hemisphere. Let's call it, and in Europe, it's still rather popular. So it works well, and it works well for passerines pretty much in the Northern Hemisphere. However, when you get away from the Northern Hemisphere into the tropics, where 8,000 species of birds occur, that system kind of breaks down. So the molts aren't necessarily related to breeding. They're certainly, you can't really say that there's a summer or a winter, and so on. So that terminology is pretty inapplicable down in the tropics. So I'm going to promote Dave Blakewell's video that just came out last week, or at least I just saw it last week, on bird molts and shorebirds here. And in Malaysia, of course, they have the same problem. You've got shorebirds breeding all times of year, and some are migratory, some are not. Is it winter or summer? I can't remember if I'm in breeding plumage or not. The URL there, Meredith will put it in the chat. I would recommend watching it. It's only about 15 minutes long, and it's a good sort of summary about what I'm going to be talking about today. So because of all this confusion with breeding and whatnot, uh, Phil Humphrey and Ken Parkes in 1959 decided to come up with a different approach to the terminology for molt and plumages, and it's called the Humphrey-Parkes terminology. Um, and um, in 1959, so what was that, 70 years ago, or 65 years ago, it wasn't received very well. The life cycle terminology, it was pretty entrenched. But over the years, we've kind of learned and accepted the value of Humphrey and Parkes, especially once we corrected a few things that they had not quite gotten right. So the Molt terminology of Humphrey and Parkes is cycle-based, and that's really important to understand. And it's framed around the complete or near complete pre-basic molt, and that's the molt once per year that all birds go through, and it's pretty much complete or not complete. And recall I mentioned that it's related to not just replacement of feathers, but a whole annual thing that animals go through to restore their body. When I talk about it in humans, I like to say, okay, it's like a vacation. All right, in July and August, we're all exhausted and we go and we take 2 weeks and we sit on the beach. That's what birds do for their pre-basic molt. They tend to find hidden places. It's not necessarily where they bred. They'll move somewhere else, go to sort of a place with cover, where they don't have to fly around a lot because they're a little bit compromised in their flight, and can find food. So August is generally a good time, especially here in the northern hemisphere. And when I say July, August, I am talking about up here. When you get to the tropics, the seasonality of molting can occur at different times of the year, but it's all sort of based on what resources are available to them, what cover is available to them. And the important thing about Humphrey-Parkes is it's considered evolutionarily homologous to molts and reptiles, and then it's found throughout all lineages of birds. So in other words, the pre-basic molt has been inherited by birds from reptiles, and it's a once-a-year event. So that's a really great thing to frame a molt terminology around, since it really doesn't necessarily relate to breeding or anything else about the bird's annual cycle. It's just this once-a-year event. So if the pre-basic molt has evolved from reptiles, and as I just mentioned, it involves more than just replacement of feathers. It's a whole alternation of body plumage. But then dinosaurs, of course, birds evolved more from dinosaurs than reptiles. So how did dinosaurs molt? That was a question nobody had kind of thought of for a while. We can't obviously know from fossils. But however, we are starting to gain a little bit of a handle on that. This is a paper by Joseph Kiat, two of them, on looking at feather imprints in some of the feathered dinosaurs. And sure enough, it's turning out that, for instance, up here, the sequence of replacement of feathers in dinosaurs matches what we see in birds now. So, basically, for most birds, starting at the inner primary and going to the outer primary. So this all kind of helps reinforce the fact that the molts in birds have evolved from molts in dinosaurs. So here's how it works, and I'm going to use Dave's graphics on this again. In adults, and we have to separate the cycles of adults, and by adult I mean those who beginning at a year of age and moving on from there. Most birds, by the time they're 1 year of age, enter what we call a definitive molt cycle, where it continues to be the same pretty much throughout their lives. So in adults, most of the world's birds undergo only one molt per cycle. They'll molt and then they keep those feathers for the entire year. And that's called the pre-basic molt, which results in basic plumage. And this circle here does have months in it, but you can ignore the months because in different places, obviously in Australia, the molts are going to be completely opposite in the time of year than they are up here. So just think of this circle as the year and don't worry about exactly what month is occurring. Okay, so again, it's a cycle-based terminology, and there's this single molt per year that it's framed around. Now, within the basic molt cycle, is what we call it, additional in what we call inserted molts have evolved along some, but not all bird lineages. So inserted molts occur when a bird basically it occurs because feathers get worn out, and in some species that inhabit harsh environments, they need to be replaced more than once per year. So within the adult cycles of birds, which is again generally the second cycle, which begins at a year of age in a bird and moves on from there, the first inserted molt to evolve is termed the pre-alternate molt. Okay, so here's the graphic again. You've got the pre-basic molt here, and then generally in the spring or just before breeding often, or 6 months later in some cases. Remember, the pre-alternated molt has evolved because feathers get worn. So it'll be sometime within the cycle, halfway through the cycle or more. They'll undergo a second molt and it's called the pre-alternate molt in birds. And again, to emphasize, this is the adult cycle from a year of age on. So the pre-basic molt is always complete or almost complete in birds. However, the pre-alternate molt is usually not complete. I mean, it's almost always not complete. There's only a handful of birds in the world that undergo 2 complete molts per year. So generally, this pre-alternate molt can be partial. It's limited to a few head feathers in a lot of birds, or back feathers. Feathers that are exposed to the sun, like tertials, often get replaced during the pre-alternate molt. But in almost all cases, I'd say 99% of birds, the pre-alternate molt is not complete. So you've still got your pre-basic molt cycle here, and within the cycle, you've got an inserted molt that's not complete. Okay, so that's a great start. Did HP get everything right the first time? No, they didn't. One of their big mistakes was to call the molt out of juvenile plumage the first pre-basic molt. So that molt now is generally called the post-juvenile molt. And so when birds hatch in the nest, they're in juvenile plumage, and that plumage is really, really weak. And so there's a premium on just developing the weakest feathers possible in the nest so they can get out of the nest, because the longer the birds stay in nests, the more subject they are to predation from snakes and jays and things like that. So they have a quick molt, usually within the first year of life, out of this juvenile plumage. And Humphrey-Parkes called that the first pre-basic molt, sort of, making it equivalent to the complete molts later, and that just ended up causing a lot more confusion. That molt, what they called the first pre-basic, and we call the post-juvenile or terms coming up, is very variable in birds. For instance, in merlins, kestrels have one, but merlins didn't. And in the life cycle terminology, then the kestrels were in the Humphrey-Parkes terminology. Even the kestrels' first quote unquote first pre-basic molt is this one of body feathers only at a month of age, and the merlin's first pre-basic molt quote unquote is the complete molt at a year of age, which equates to the second pre-basic molt in most other birds. So that kind of messed things up. So in 2003, Steve Howell and several of us came along and decided to change that problem, and we called it the first basic problem. And what we did was we renamed the molt into juvenile plumage. So this is the molt that they grow feathers in the nest, and it's often referred to as the pre-juvenile molt, as the first pre-basic. So that makes sense, because that molt into juvenile plumage is complete. It involves all the flight feathers, just like adult pre-basic molts. So it's a complete molt. So that means that all of the pre-basic molts, starting with the first pre-basic molt, are complete molts. Now, the term juvenile is so entrenched And there doesn't seem to be anything really adverse about it in molt terminology. So most of us have retained the words pre-juvenile molt and not post-juvenile, pre-juvenile molt is a synonym for the first pre-basic molt. Most of us still say it's the pre-juvenile molt that ends up in juvenile plumage. So these two birds are in juvenile plumage. And then rather than saying first basic plumage. So it's their equivalent, but we don't say first basic plumage too often. We just continue to use the word juvenile plumage for these birds. So then what do we name the molt that Humphrey and Parkes used to call the first pre-basic molt and was also called the post-juvenile molt? We came up with another term, the preformative molt, for that molt. So I used to teach a lot of classes, banding classes in molt before 2003. And to get Humphrey and Parkes terminology across when the first pre-basic molt problem was still there was just really hard. It was challenging. And when we made this switch and called that unique molt within the first cycle, the preformative molt, it just really solidified and clarified that cycle and the entire terminology. So from that point on, it's been a lot easier for students of molt to understand the Humphrey-Parkes cycle just by that simple change. So again, most, if not all, birds have a molt in the first cycle out of juvenile plumage. In many species, this molt is needed to replace low-quality juvenile feathers within a month or two of a 14-month cycle. And that's another point about the first cycle, is that it tends to be about 14 months because the birds, say, hatch in June, but don't molt again until the following August. So that's a 14-month cycle. So that would be another reason why juveniles need to undergo an extra inserted molt within the first cycle that is not needed then in the second cycle and beyond. So the preformative molt, which we now call it, is quite variable, as I mentioned. It can be partial, it can be absent, it can be incomplete, it can be what we call eccentric, like in the painted bunting here. It can be complete in quite a few birds, Eurasian starling, wren tit. A lot of birds in the tropics also have complete molts, preformative molts. So that is all in response to resource availability and challenges, environmental constraints on their life history, whether or not they can get away with a limited or an absent first cycle molt. And we'll talk a little bit more about those birds later, or they need to undergo an incomplete or a partial or even a complete molt. Okay, so again, to summarize, the first year has this extra unique inserted molt called the preformative molt. And it's not found, to our knowledge, in any second cycles or later, this extra molt. However, a lot of birds that have that definitive or that adult pre-alternate molt I talked about also have a first pre-alternate molt. So here's the cycle here. Hatch, it goes into juvenile plumage, it undergoes preformative molt into formative plumage, and then a lot of the birds shorebirds, for instance, that have pre-alternate molt in the adult cycle will also have a pre-alternate molt in the first cycle as well, which results in first alternate plumage. And then from there, it goes from first alternate plumage into the pre-basic molt, just like before, into basic plumage, and then alternate plumage. So starting with that second pre-basic molt, which clarification of the first basic problem synonymize that molt amongst all birds. It's the complete molt at a year of age. You enter into the adult cycle, which then continues on throughout the bird's life, whether it lives one more year or 25 more years. So most, if not all, birds enter the adult cycle following the second pre-basic molt. They're larger birds. There are two things about birds that may not. One is that the plumage may not mature completely, and that would be birds like gulls or certain birds that that take 2 or longer years to reach adult-like plumage. So you can actually then, in those cases, tell second cycle birds and third cycle birds just by their plumages, their body plumage. And then in other species, the second pre-basic molt actually will be earlier or less complete in very large birds than later molts. And so in that way, even the molt cycle doesn't quite get into the normal complete molt of most birds. But I'd say, 98, 97% of birds in the world have a complete pre-basic molt and a complete and then if they do have it, an pre-alternate molt, but just have a complete pre-basic molt once a year. Okay, so as I've sort of mentioned a little bit, Humphrey and Parkes molts result in their plumages. And this is an important thing too, to understand about the HP system, is that it's entirely based on molts. It's not based at all on plumages. And so pre-breeding, breeding plumage, that sort of thing doesn't work well within the Humphrey-Parkes system. So a pre-juvenile molt, which is the equivalent of first pre-basic molt, results in juvenile plumage. A pre-basic molt results in basic plumage, a preformative into formative plumage, and a pre-alternate molt into alternate plumage. So that's just the way it goes. But the important thing to know about that is that it does that the system is based entirely on molts, and we do ignore plumage color when we're working with the HP system. And again, I'll get back to that in a little bit. So teaching workshops, I'm a lot happier and gleeful because it sort of seems to make sense to everybody now. Here are some good resources to look for on, or to read, to obtain and get on the Humphrey-Parkes system, how it works, when, how it varies in birds of the world. So these are books that I would recommend getting if you're interested in knowing more about it, especially the one on the right, I should say, which just came out last year. Also get Gaillard. Santi Gaillard has been a warrior with us in the molt field. And it's a great book. It's available online that treats birds in Mexico and really, really detail, although he does, in this particular book, use the life cycle terminology. So in summary, the pre-basic molt cycle appears to be basal to all birds, first evolving in reptiles or their ancestors. Then the preformative molt may also be ancestral as well. Okay, so I'm going to get to that in a second here too. An extra ecdysis event, and that's what they call molt in reptiles, to accommodate rapid body growth. So we think now, and this will be a big theme coming up here, that the preformative molt may also be ancestral. It might also have occurred in reptiles, because if you think about it, a reptile's body grows quickly within its first year and then not so much after. So maybe it evolved a separate shedding of skin or ecdysis event during that stage, which may have then evolved into the preformative molt of birds. That's a huge speculation, but it is something that we're working on, and you'll see why we think that might be the case a little later. And then pre-alternate molts, by contrast, have evolved and disappeared many times along bird lineages, so should not be considered homologous. So obviously, a pre-alternate molt in a grebe, we all know most grebes go from a basic plumage that's white and gray to a alternate plumage, which is often black and orange and red. A real big plumage change is not homologous with, say, a pre-alternate molt in a honey creeper or a honey eater, like I just showed there. These are molts that have evolved separately along the lineages of birds according to the needs of each family or group or species. Okay, so once we got Humphrey and Parkes figured out and could see this molt framework, we started discovering things that we hadn't noticed before, like actually Merlin, which I mentioned, and peregrines do have a preformative molt. It's very limited to a few back feathers or a few breast feathers, but it is a formative molt. And in raptors and some seabirds, these birds that have pretty well protected nest sites, that say seabirds, a lot of them are raised in burrows, or raptors, even if they're in an exposed nest, nobody's going to mess around with those young. So they have a chance to grow stronger juvenile feathers than most. So there isn't as much of a need for that preformative molt as there is in passerines that come out downy and weak with weak feathering. But it does seem like they do undergo this limited preformative molt, which might have just been a vestigial carryover from the birds that falcons evolved from, for instance. Another thing we realized is that everybody was calling the plumes of herons and egrets alternate feathers because of our being stuck in the idea that there was a pre-breeding molt to produce breeding plumage. But as it turns out, these feathers start growing in October, November. They're part of the annual pre-basic complete molt. It's just that they don't get fully formed and obvious until the spring. And so everybody thought there was another molt of those. But when we actually looked at it, there's no basic feathers that precede the alternate plumes. They're just it comes right out during the complete molt, and that's that. So hummingbirds has been a challenge. There's been some really interesting opinions and debates on the molts of hummingbirds. Most of them were just thought to undergo the normal once a year pre-basic molt thing. However, a lot of our migratory ones start molting only 6 months of age. And so the question is that a complete second pre-basic molt pulled forward, or is that a complete preformative molt? And then Donna Dittman and Steve Cardiff documented a pre-alternate molt in ruby-throated hummingbird, and that just upset the entire apple cart on the molts in hummingbirds. So we're still working on it a little bit, but we've got several papers out now trying to get that all figured out. And then recently, Chris Clark and others down in Brazil have been documenting pre-alternate molts in some of the Brazilian and tropical species of hummingbirds as well. So that should be helping us understand how these molts evolved in hummingbirds. Okay, so another thing Humphrey and Parkes didn't get right for some groups was that they ignored their own precept to base terminology on molts and not ensuing plumage coloration. So generally, they set up a real good framework for looking at molts and not at plumages, with one big exception, and that's ducks. So ducks, because ducks, mallards, for instance, are colorful in the winter, Humphrey and Parkes, along with everybody else, called this the breeding plumage, which then got translated into this being the alternate plumage in a duck. But once you start looking at the molts of ducks, and then this plumage that male ducks, these are both adult male mallards, is called eclipse plumage by the hunters, and it's was considered the basic plumage because of its color, not for no other reason. But then when you look at both the extent of the molt, in this case, all feathers are replaced, and in this case, not all feathers are replaced, just mostly those that are that hide the color of the bird are replaced. And then as well, you trace the molts from ancestors, the geese, to ducks. You realize, hey, this is the pre-basic molt that ducks go through in the fall after breeding into the colorful plumage, and should be considered the basic plumage over here, and that this is a limited molt that occurs in late spring and early summer to get the bird into a brown cryptic plumage, and it needs to be in that sort of plumage because ducks, along with many other birds, molt all of their primaries and secondaries at once. We call it a synchronous molt, and become flightless for 3 or 4 weeks. And so in that case, they want to be in a plumage like this, where they can hide in marshes and stuff and not in the bright plumage. So in this case, the pre-alternate molt has evolved. And I'll come back to this theme again a couple times, but again, the pre-alternate molt probably evolved originally in the ancestral duck, just to replace feathers more than once per year. But then various species have co-opted the pre-alternate molt to also change color depending on their needs. So in this case, the mallard needed to be less bright for the wing molt. So it developed, even though the molt itself probably evolved because the birds were worn, it developed this dichotomy. And not, of course, not all ducks do this. The mottled duck, the black duck, the Hawaiian duck, which are close relatives of mallard, Mexican duck was even considered the same species. They have males that look more or less the same year round and look like females. So that's just kind of goes to show too that plumage coloration can come and go really quickly. It's a plastic trait. It's not a trait that we should hang our evolutionary considerations on for birds. So here's another example of how plumage doesn't really equate with molts, is that the plumage, the molt cycle and what we call the color deposition cycle are not always in line. So you get birds that say start molting early, like this summer tanager. The first few primaries that get replaced are actually yellow. They're not red. So that's because the color deposition cycle hasn't quite revolved into red yet. So when we look at birds, adult male summer tanagers, for instance, that replace feathers accidentally through the years, then what we see is that feathers that adult males replace in about April through June are green, and then those replaced in July and later are red. So there's a deposition color cycle that underlies the molt cycle. And in this case, in a lot of red birds, it might also relate to diet, carotenoids in the diet. But in any case, they can be out of sync a little bit and result in these different colors at different times of the year, depending on when the molt occurs relative to the plumage deposition cycle. So, by the way, all these papers I'm mentioning are available, at least the ones I'm on, are available here at this website. And Meredith will stick that in the chat for you as well. So if this stuff floats your boat, there's a lot of reading you can do there. So I used the color in the summer tanager to look at how molts in first cycle birds occur, and whether to call the molt, how to call the molt that occurs on the wintering grounds. And traditionally, in life cycle terminology, anything that occurred on the summer grounds is called the post-juvenile molt, and anything that occurs on the wintering grounds is called the first pre-breeding molt. But that's an oversimplification, I think. And so what I came up with was that, for instance, summer tanager will start the molt on the summer grounds, suspend it, and continue on the winter grounds. And that at the same time on the wintering grounds, they'll molt some body feathers during a pre-alternate molt. So those body feathers are getting replaced twice per year. So the question is, these tertials and greater coverts that get replaced on the wintering ground, should we equate that with the preformative molt before that started on the summer grounds, or the first pre-alternate molt that occurs on the wintering grounds? And it's not exactly a one-to-one thing. We're still working on it a little bit, but what I think is correct is that the sequence is important in this case, because sequences of feather replacement are very, very fixed in birds. So as long as, and in the secondaries, typically you get a certain sequence of replacement. The second tertial goes first, followed by the inner one, then going out the wing like that. So in this case, they can mold up to 4 secondaries, but you see a certain sequence of replacement that occurs. Now, if so the sequence of, say, S8 starting on the summering grounds continues. So in this case, we would call the yellow feathers and the red formative. They're all part of that preformative molt that continued on the wintering grounds, whereas the second replacement here of the second tertial would be considered part of the first pre-alternate. So I think by taking this sequence approach, we can actually understand these molts better. And so it's an incomplete preformative molt that continues on the wintering ground. And then furthermore, to complicate things even further, in some cases, kingbirds replacing primaries, and especially shorebirds that replace outer primaries, the end of the preformative molt can actually overlap with replacement of body feathers or even another sequence within the flight feathers of the first pre-alternate molt. So I'm convinced this is the best way to look at it now, having looked at this for a long time. Otherwise, it's kind of random whether you call the molt on the wintering grounds the continuation of the preformative molt or a new first pre-alternate molt on the wintering grounds. Where would you draw the line otherwise? And I think the best way to draw that line is by actually looking at the sequence of feather replacement like this. Okay, so are we out of the woods yet with this? No, we are not. When I gave the Cornell talk, so basically we're still kind of a little bit entrenched in this. Europe and Africa tends to still use the life cycle terminology, whereas the Americans and Australia and to a large part Asia use the Humphrey-Parkes system. And a lot of this has to do with where you are relative to the equator. Of course, the life cycle doesn't work well on the equator, so a lot of the banders and ornithologists in, say, neotropics in Central America and South America, and as well those in sort of tropical Africa and India and Asia are kind of converting now to Humphrey-Parkes because the other system really doesn't work there. However, for birds in the northern hemisphere, they still do. So we're still in ongoing discussion. So when I gave the talk to Cornell, it was a few days before the World Cup. So I decided to throw this slide in and say, okay, here we are, Europe and Africa versus the American and Australia. Perhaps we'll have the answer on which molt terminology wins of the Sunday following that talk. And Argentina won. So I was like, Humphrey and Parkes, yay, yay. But then the women came along and wait a minute, Spain won. So we are still in this debate. Joseph Chiat published then this paper in 2022 advocating for life cycle terminology and say it's simpler to understand. And indeed, he ran a test and most people did have an easier time understanding life cycle terminology than Humphrey-Parkes. However, again, this is a real boreal-centric viewpoint. If you get away from England and Europe and North America, the answer becomes different. It doesn't work. So I rebutted with that paper on the summer tanagers and the sequence. I rebutted Joseph's paper was a rebuttal to my paper. So here we are a couple years ago. It is a friendly rivalry, though, I have to say. Joseph's a good colleague. We've actually published a few papers together. He invited me on the paper clarifying molts in Archaeopteryx. And then we've got a paper right now in press on molt in white-winged black terns. And my conclusion is there's just not enough of us in the bird molt world to be at odds with each other just over the terminology. So and then again, Santi Guiar was a life cycle proponent, but I think we're converting him because as you see in this paper that we're both on here, he did use preformative molt. So again, these papers were based on neotropical birds where the life cycle system wasn't working. So we're kind of forced to use Humphrey-Parkes in that case. I should also say that I was a big, proponent of life cycle terminology, and Lars Svensson of Sweden, of course, is one of its main proponents as well. And he came up with his identification guide to European passerines, which I modeled and I'll get to that in a second, my work after his work. So I'm greatly indebted to Lars, even though he's still a fierce adherent to life cycle terminology. We went out in Sweden looking for white-tailed eagles, and that's when he convinced me that I should produce a North American counterpart to his book here. And full circle, sort of a white-tailed eagle just last week flew over San Francisco for the first record in California. So I've had white-tailed eagles on my mind a lot lately. So here's our companion guide that was modeled after Lars's, the original 1987 version. It involved Dave DeSanti, who Meredith mentioned started the Institute for Bird Populations. Dave unfortunately passed away last year chasing a bird. Steve Howell, that's me. The Comandante Marcos is sort of an inside joke with his mask off, of course. Robert Unick. So the four of us produced the counterpart to Lars's book, and we did actually use Humphrey-Parkes' system there. But the problem is we were just synonymizing life cycle terms with Humphrey-Parkes terms here, and so that didn't do anybody any good. So I would say the Molt terminology here, including the use of first pre-basic, that didn't advance us too much. By the way, Rafael Rueda Hernandez is spearheading the translation of the identification guide into Spanish, and so he'll be presenting. In fact, I think I'm presenting on that next week. So we're going to announce that coming out next week, April 5th, I think. So again, the two companion books, even though we use different terminology. So in response to Yosef's thing about life cycle, we came out with another rebuttal, and here it is, and it just came out last week. And that's what this we'll conclude this talk with, discussing this paper. So to begin with, it had the original four authors of Howell et al. 2003. So that was kind of nice. It was like a 20-year reunion of that paper. And what we wanted to do is, okay, so in our experience, I'm going to quote from the paper here, newer students grasp the HP system quickly, whereas older ornithologists, including ourselves, and I've highlighted that, who first learn life cycle molt terminology, often have initial difficulty envisioning the HP system's evolutionary approach. So we were kind of all stuck in this problem of just equating the post-juvenile molt and the pre-formative molt, thinking they're the same thing, or the pre-breeding molt is the same as the pre-alternate molt, or the post-breeding molt is the same as the pre-basic molt. And to a large extent, that is the case in the Northern Hemisphere. But again, it doesn't follow for birds that, say, migrate and molt on the wintering grounds. But kind of we were all stuck in that. And what I've realized was it's kind of hard to make that mental switch from the easier life cycle terminology to one that's based on homologies and evolution, because it involves a sort of a second dimension. It's not just what you're seeing on the surface. It's thinking about how the molt evolved and how it got there. So there's like a time element. But once you do that, once you see that time element, or try to look at molts in terms of their evolution rather than just what's happening on the surface, it becomes a lot easier. It becomes a lot greater. It becomes really fun. Even molt's never been thought of as a fun topic, but yeah, it does. So believe me. So that's what this paper is about, to try to get people to kind of understand this approach a little bit better. So Howell et al. 2003 defined four molt cycles strategies. Simple basic strategy, which is no performative molt or pre-alternate molt. So they have that molt into juvenile plumage, no more molts until the second pre-basic molt. Complex basic strategy, a preformative molt occurs in the first cycle, but no pre-alternate molts. Simple alternate means a single molt in the first cycle and pre-alternate molts in later cycles, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then complex alternate is like the shorebirds in Dave Bakewell's video, that undergo both two molts in the first cycle, two inserted molts, the preformative and the first pre-alternate molt, and then a pre-alternate molt in the adult cycle. And these strategies shouldn't be considered fixed adaptive strategies, but more or less they're kind of guidelines in which we can try to understand the evolution of molts better. And this illustration, by the way, was done by our Institute for Bird Populations biologist Lauren Helton, and there's a big call to make a poster out of this right now. So we're going to try to figure out how to do that. So what do you see first about this? That it's largely purple. Okay, so what's purple? Purple is complex basic strategy. So over here, that's the strategy that there's a preformative molt, but no pre-alternate molt. So out of juvenile plumage, they have that partial, usually partial, sometimes incomplete, sometimes complete preformative molt in the first cycle, unique to that first cycle, and then no pre-alternate molts. So if you notice, even some of the very primitive birds like tinamous, and we don't really know a lot about the first cycle molts of ostriches and rheas and things, but that'll be something to look into. But I'll bet you they do have preformative molts. That these really primitive birds looks like they did have preformative molts as well. So we're going to propose that the complex basic strategy is actually ancestral to all birds. That was the original molt strategy, including, as I mentioned, that preformative molt that might have evolved from reptiles as reptile body size grew. So looking up the tree, a lot of birds just seem to retain the complex basic strategy all the way through their evolutionary history. Okay, and again, because a lot of these primitive birds do have preformative molts and no pre-alternate molts, some of them do have pre-alternate molts, so we'll get to that, but most of them don't. We think that the complex basic strategy it may be ancestral to all birds. Okay, so again, I'm going to repeat a little bit of this stuff, but tinamous are a family of ratites, the most primitive group of flightless birds that also includes ostriches, rheas, and emus. The fact that tinamous and other basal bird taxa include preformative molt suggests that this molt could have evolved from reptiles, which may undergo an extra shedding of skin in the first year as the body size grows rapidly. Okay, but we do need, I mean, this is highly speculative at this point. There's no it's going to be very difficult to be able to actually confirm this, but it's fun to think about. As such, and since these basal taxa lack pre-alternate molts, the authors propose that the complex basic strategy is ancestral to all bird lineages. And I've said this now 3 times, but I think it's really an important point to grasp when you're considering molt terminology and want to study molts today. So here at the bottom are certain groups of birds that undergo the complex basic strategy. Okay, so a preformative molt appears not to occur in at least some lineages. So some birds still seem to lack a preformative molt altogether. These include albatrosses, storm petrels, penguins, New World vultures, some kingfishers, and ivory gull. As these current day taxa all occur along lineages that basically exhibited the complex basic strategy, we propose that the preformative molt has been lost evolutionarily along these lineages rather than the simple basic strategy being ancestral. And the reason I emphasize that last point is that in Howell and all 2003, we just assumed that the simple basic strategy was ancestral because it was the simplest strategy. 1 molt per year. Reptiles probably did 1 molt per year, easy. And then you go right into it. However, now it looks like a lot of these basal bird taxa have preformative molts. So that might not be the case, at least looking at evolution with a phylogenetic tree like this. Now, we've started to get some questions about whether phylogenetic trees are even worth the salt that they're made out of, but that's a whole different discussion, and I still think they are. So here are these birds that seem to have lacked to lack pre-formative molts. Now notice they all come off of lines that had CBS, complex basic strategy originally. So that's why we think they probably lost the preformative molt rather than this strategy being ancestral. So again, I'm not going to read all of this, but here you go again. This, here, let me go back a second. Somewhere here. Oh yeah, here at the bottom is the link to these particular graphics on this subject, so you can follow that link, which Meredith has put in to actually read these and look at them and review them again. But again, here are some birds along the bottom that supposed to have lack pre-formative molts within the first cycle. They just have go from juvenile plumage straight into the second pre-basic molt. Okay, so now pre-alternate molts, as we mentioned, have evolved independently in both first and later cycles along various bird lineages, including basal taxa such as ptarmigans and grebes and ducks. Okay, so they all have pre-formative molts, pre-alternate molts way down here. Then you've got birds in the middle like gulls and alcids, and then a lot of passerines have evolved this strategy of having pre-alternate molts, two molts within the adult cycle. So that's so these are okay. So then there's the case that Dave mentioned, and that a lot of these birds do undergo, and that's that they also have first pre-alternate molt as well. So they have two molts in the first cycle, preformative, first pre-alternate, and then one molt in the adult cycle. And so that's the complex alternate strategy. So here are the birds that show that, and they're kind of all over the place. So they should not be considered homologous, as I mentioned, because they've evolved along lots of different lineages of birds, and that are obviously not ancestral to each other. So pre-alternate molts can evolve fairly quickly within groups, and then also get lost, we think. So if pre-alternate molt may have been gained and may have gotten lost on some of these lines, and we don't know that. But by and large, once a family develops a pre-alternate molt, a lot of members of the family have them. That's not always the case, though, because some shorebirds, for instance, and some wood warblers don't have pre-alternate molts. So by the time you get to the end of the line, the pre-alternate molt may come and go rather quickly, depending on the bird's habits and needs. And I would say, in a large part, depending on how much solar exposure the birds are exposed to through the years and through the annual cycle. And if you notice, like just looking at wood warblers, the birds that have the pre-alternate molts tend to be the ones that are in the treetops and in the sun, and the ones that lack them, like ovenbirds and so on, are the ones that are in the shade a lot more. So that seems to be a connection. And Ryan Terrell did a paper specifically on that question that seemed to confirm that the birds that are exposed to more solar exposure throughout the cycle are the ones that end up getting the pre-alternate molts. So you'll see it a lot in migratory shorebirds, but some of the residents or shorebirds may not have pre-alternate molts. And then there are, as I mentioned, a lot of these taxa, terminal taxa up here that still exhibit the complex basic strategy. So again, that doesn't mean that there was never a pre-alternate molt along the line along their ancestral lineage. It's just that we don't have any evidence of it. And so we can maybe assume, for instance, that corvids and I can't see what's at the top here, but some of these other mimids and things never had an pre-alternate molt along their entire evolutionary history. Okay, so now we've got the fourth category, which is a little more complicated. It's called the simple alternate strategy. And that's the one in which there's only one molt within the first cycle. And then there is pre-alternate molts in adult cycles. So that first molt is interesting. It could be a preformative molt, it could be a first pre-alternate molt, or it could be a merging of the two. In any case, there's only one molt there, and then again one molt, inserted molt in the adult cycle. So what are some of the birds that do this? We've got pelicans, we've got loons, cormorants. These are all birds that don't breed until they're 2 or 3 or later years old. So and they have evolved from the complex basic strategy. So we think that potentially they just evolved a pre-alternate molt in their adult cycles that wasn't needed in their first cycle. And indeed, when you look at the molts of these, it looks like the first cycle molt is closer to a preformative molt in birds that they evolved from than a first pre-alternate molt. So because they don't breed until they're 2 or 3 years old, they did not evolve. They only evolved that or they only retained it, I should say. They didn't evolve it for coloration or display, but they may have evolved it because of being worn and then retained it for that reason, because it then was adaptive to mate selection, being more colorful. So that's one group of birds that exhibit the simple altered strategy. And another one is large gulls, and quite a few alcids only have that one molt within the first cycle, but then pre-alternate molts in adult cycles as well. But if you look at them, they've largely come off of a line that included complex alternate strategy before. So we think in this case, it could be that the ancestral gull and the smaller gulls do exhibit complex alternate strategy. So the larger gulls have lost one of the molts in the first cycle. And so we think it's a case where that molt in the first cycle has either gotten lost, either the preformative or the pre-alternate molt wasn't needed, or probably more likely it just kind of got merged. So two molts in the ancestor merged into one molt in the more derived taxa. And that seems to occur with alcids as well. So here's basically a repeat of what I just said, involving simple alternate strategy in gulls and alcids. Now, the interesting thing, like puffins are interesting because they really don't seem to have any molt in their first, that's equivalent to preformative molts of other alcids. But they do have a pre-alternate molt in the spring just before breeding of head feathers, which is very similar to later pre-alternate molt. So in this case, it looks more like the preformative molt got lost in puffins, but they still retained the pre-alternate molt. Whereas in other birds like gulls, it almost seems like the preformative molt was retained, but the first pre-alternate molt was lost. So more work to do on these birds that undergo the simple alternate strategy. So to conclude, taking an evolutionary perspective makes the endeavor of understanding avian molts less daunting. And this is a quote in the blog piece there that I have. Once one envisions the evolutionary basis of HP, which can be difficult to do for those of us who grew up on the life cycle system, the categorization and study of molts becomes much less confusing, much more satisfying, and actually rather enjoyable. So I encourage you, especially anyone from Europe who's or elsewhere who's just still using life cycle or tends to want to use it, to kind of really give this a good whirl. Give Humphrey-Parkes a good try. Learn the terms. It's not really that difficult. And then really think about molts in birds in an evolutionary context, not just based on their timing relative to breeding and other events that we see today. And that's my talk. And I'll be happy to sit around and take questions as long as you guys have them. So I'll stop sharing that.
All right. So again, I'm going to apologize for any confusion. My little avatar on here is Rodney Siegel because I'm using his account to host the webinar. But this is me, Meredith Walker. And so let's start off with some of the questions. So the first question we got was from Donna, and this was farther back in the talk, but it was, do North American passerines molt out of their juvenile plumage before their first migration?
Most do. Of course, most passerines a lot of them are resident, so they don't even migrate. So they're going to undergo that molt, usually near the natal territory, but often not. We're learning that a lot of birds undergo that molt. They leave the actual breeding territory, and you can understand that the adults have probably exhausted that territory feeding their young to get them out of the nest. So they may move down the block. They might move a few miles. There's a whole suite of birds in Western North America that fly hundreds of miles to Mexico to undergo the molt and take advantage of a monsoonal system down there. So it's all over the place. And then there are other birds that of course go all the way to the wintering grounds before beginning that preformative, or what we call preformative, or post-juvenile molt. So it's quite variable, and I think, as I've emphasized a couple of times, it's really dependent on the life cycle needs and the strategies, migratory strategies, and amount of solar exposure, and all these things that each individual species is subject to during their first cycle.
Cool. All right. So our next question, excuse me, was from Manuel Grossolet. I'm probably mispronouncing his last name. But he asked, if molt is the changing of feathers, what about the PJ, I assume pre-juvenile, because the juvenile feather is not really a replacement of feather. So could it be considered a molt pre-juvenile?
Hi, Manuel. How's it going? You always seem to get in here with your second question. Let's see. Maybe, you're going to have to ask a avian physiologist that, and I'm not one. So I don't know. In a lot of cases, it does actually push out the follicles are activated for natal down. And some birds even have two coats of natal down, and then the juvenile feathers appear to push those out, because in a lot of cases, the natal down sticks to the end of the juvenile feathers even up till and after fledging. So I would say, why not? If it results in our understanding molt terminology a little bit better or something like that, then yeah, I say yeah, consider it a molt.
Okay. Then Amar asked, he had two questions, or he or she had two questions. If molt sequences help define molts, how would this work with Franklin's gull? When do we know when the first pre-alternate molt commences?
Hi, Amar. Amar's coming out with a book very soon, I think, about gulls. So I encourage everyone to get that, because it's going to have the latest in this question revolving gull molt. Franklin's gull is one of the rare species that has two complete molts per year in the adult cycle. And actually, when I do molt talks, I have a question that I like to ask. And what are the two North American species that do this? Have two complete molt, a complete pre-alternate molt in the adult cycle. There's only two. And Franklin's gull is one. And so you'd think, okay, the other might be what, laughing gull or Sabine's gull, or and then it's not, it's bobolink. So there's two birds in North America that undergo two complete molts, Franklin's gull and bobolink. So then I ask, why? Why those two? Obviously, they're not related, and they didn't evolve that strategy along the same line. So why would they do it? Well, think about it. Migration. Okay, both are long distance migrations. Migrants. No, not male only. I think both of them do. And in bobolink. And then they go all the way to the southern hemisphere, and they're both birds that inhabit open country. So these are species, and in the case of bobolink and maybe Franklin's gull, kind of harsh environments too. So think about bobolink. nests in grassy, open, solar exposed habitats in North America. And then it goes down to Argentina to the Pampas region, which is also a harsh environment and solar exposed. So they need to replace their feathers twice a year. Same with Franklin's gull. It, breeds up here in the prairie region and then goes down to the coast of Chile. So that's getting essentially 16 hours of solar exposure per day in both the summer up here and the summer down there. So that is, I think, why those two species do undergo full molts. Now, Amar, I'm going to have to try to remember what the first cycle what happens in the first cycle of Franklin's gull, but I think let me think. So the question would be if it goes down to Chile and then replaces all of its feathers, but it hasn't replaced them during the preformative molt, should that be considered the pre? Yes, I would say if I'm getting it right, that you would consider the replacement of primaries there the first pre-alternate molt rather than the preformative molt. And there are equivalent cases like this. So generally, first alternate feather replaces a formative feather. So that means the follicle was activated twice during the cycle, and that feather was replaced twice. And that was the case with the example I showed with the summer tanager. But there are some cases in a passerine in North America. A couple of them are yellow warbler and indigo bunting, which can have really extensive first pre-alternate molts, more so than the preformative molt. So there are cases where juvenile feathers get replaced by first alternate feathers. And again, so what you do is look at laughing gull, the closest relative, and it strikes me they have a limited or a partial preformative molt. And so if you extend that to Franklin's, you would say the Franklins had a partial preformative and then adopted the adult cycle by then replacing primaries during the first pre-alternate molt, just like the adults do. So hope that answers that question.
Okay. We have a question from Neil. Could the strategies be polyphyletic and convergent rather than monophyletic and divergent?
Yeah. Overall, I think not. I think mold is very, very plastic. It's easily changed. You get species like golden plovers that used to be considered the same species, although now we've split them for whatever reason. But American golden plovers have a complete preformative molt and a pre-alternate molt that occurs on migration rather than on the wintering grounds, and it's completely different from Pacific golden plover. And actually, some of the papers that recommended splitting them pointed to the difference in molt, saying, "What's a hybrid going to do?" That's a good question, but I bet it's not going to do anything that's going to prevent it from existing. So I don't think molt is necessarily a hardwired enough thing to say that it's going to have that much of an influence on its evolution. I hope I answered that correctly or answered the question at all.
Okay. Our next question from J Duff, their little screen name. Has it been possible to identify when a bird lineage or group gained or lost a molt in geological time?
Yeah, no, it's going to be speculative, I think, probably till the end, unless we can figure out a way from fossils. And who knows these days with getting DNA from fossils and getting even maybe stable isotopes from fossils, who knows? Maybe we'll be able to answer that question a little bit. We're still in the stage where I don't think we can really answer that at all. However, I think thinking about it alone helps us understand molt a lot more. Just thinking about how it might have evolved. Then we're able to kind of see the relationships between various molt strategies in today's birds, and that helps us really understand the subject overall. So I think that's my answer to it at this point. But who knows? Maybe the technology is really advancing a lot in these areas. Like DNA from fossils. Whoever thought? So maybe there'll be a way to get at that question a little bit more in the future.
All right, cool. Let's see. Carlos asked, is molt strategy variable among populations of the same species?
Yeah, occasionally it can be. And again, I'll go to shorebirds as a good example. And in this case, it relates a lot to migratory strategy. So, and this is well documented, say, black-bellied plover or what they call gray plover in Europe. The birds that winter, their winter range extends from, you know, temperate northern latitudes all the way down to South America, tip of South America. And so the black-bellied plovers that molt that stay in the northern hemisphere have a rapid preformative molt, like a lot of birds do, to get it done. It's partial, and they want to get it done before the onset of winter. Whereas the ones that go down to the tropics or to South America or Africa end up having more time to do the preformative molt. They're not under that constraint of winter. They have more resources because they're in a summer down there rather than a winter. And so they'll undergo a much more complete preformative molt, and it'll also be extended through the entire non-breeding season. So that's kind of an example of within species variation in molt. And you can equate it to it's pretty directly to its migratory habit. And so that's good. And it kind of is an example of how environmental conditions can really mold molt strategies rather quickly if it occurs within the same species. And again, it means, basically it means that molt's very plastic and easily changeable.
Great. So our next question is from Anne. From a metabolic feather building perspective, what does suspend molt mean? Put off starting some of the feathers, start maturing feathers, but not finished until later? Question mark.
Yeah. So basically the way I look at that is that molt is interrupted. So you're having a molt and then it gets interrupted by another annual event. So in a lot of cases, say a turn, let's take a common turn on the breeding grounds, it fails breeding. It hangs around up there for a couple more weeks or something like that. And it starts its molt. It says, okay, time to start the molt. So it molts a few inner primaries, and then it's like, oh, time to migrate. So it suspends that molt, and then it migrates to wherever it's going. And then once it gets there, it starts the molt. And the important thing is that it starts it where it left off. Okay, so if it molted P1, 2, and 3 on the summer grounds, and then gets to the winter grounds, then it starts at P4, 5, and 6. So there's no double replacement of feathers or anything like that. So I think that's kind of how it goes. And what I'm finding more by looking at I do editing for Birds of the World, and which is a dream job really, because I get to look at molts and I get to use the Macaulay library and look at molts for birds around the world and figure out birds in tropical regions and a lot of species where molt hasn't even been uttered in the context of the species, let alone even thought about. So it's kind of fun to look at all these birds in tropical Africa and Asia and South America and elsewhere, as well as temperate areas, to try to figure out molt. One thing that's kind of cool, I think, is that in tropical systems, you often have a double breeding system, breeds twice a year. It might depend on rain, it might not. But I'm finding that the molt cycle in some of these birds is more fixed. The annual molt cycle in tropical birds may be more fixed. And then the breeding will occur when breeding, is less fixed on an annual cycle. It might, if it's suddenly starts raining, they might suddenly go into breeding condition. And we found this in American Samoa by looking at the birds' molts really closely there. So it seems like they can start a molt and then, hey, it's time to breed. Conditions are good. They stop the molt, they suspend the molt. they breed, and then they start it again afterwards. So there's another example of suspending molt for another event. And then a third example is raptors, like hawks in nests. The female comes to the nest, they lay the egg, she's incubating, she's kind of sitting there for a month. The male might be feeding her, or she might be getting up and getting food on her own. She'll start that molt, the primary molt, while sitting on the nest, while incubating, drop a few feathers, and then once the chicks hatch, the molt gets suspended because then she's got to get out with the male and find food. And so molt suspended, and then after the chicks fledge, as is normal with birds, then the molt resumes. But again, it starts with a few feathers, suspends, and then it resumes where it left off. Doesn't start all over again. So these are all kind of examples of suspended molt, and how I want to look at it. It's the molting process is just suspended. It's what the word means, and then resumed. And by the way, an arrested molt, that's a different term, means the molt stops and does not resume until the following cycle. And then in that cycle, it starts from the beginning sequence. So if you have a bird, say, that molts P1 to 6 and then stops and doesn't molt the rest, and then a year later it starts again, it could start with P7 in very large birds that undergo what we call Staffelmauser, but also it starts again with P1. So that molt strategy we'd consider arrested rather than suspended.
Great. So Sergio asked a question that Ken Burton answered in the chat, but it might be useful to answer here as well. Why do hummingbirds appear as SAS in the simple alternate strategy in the illustration?
Oh, well, that's kind of I alluded to it. There's still debate. That's how I look at it. I look at it that, so the question is, let's take a rufous hummingbird, and Desi Seaberth and I did a paper on them. The bird hatches, and then let's take a male, as it's flying south in its first migration, it starts molting some gorget feathers. So the juvenile rufous hummingbird has no gorget feathers, but then by the time it gets to the wintering ground, it's got a scattering of gorget feathers. And then it gets to the wintering grounds, and at about 6 months of age starts a complete molt. So the question is, that molt of gorget feathers, is that like a funny little pre-supplemental type of molt, or what we call auxiliary preformative molt, before the complete preformative molt? Or should we consider that gorget replacement the preformative molt, and then the second pre-basic molt starts, it just happens to start 6 months earlier? So that's the interpretation I take, which is that first, and it turns out it's more than gorget, its body, its head, a lot of feathers. And this is what Dittman and Cardiff documented in ruby-throated hummingbird as well, is that molt includes not just a few gorget feathers, and it occurs in females too. So I think that's a legitimate preformative molt. If you look at swifts, closest relatives, it matches that. They have a limited or partial preformative molt. And so then what I say is that molt, the complete molt that starts at 6 months, is actually the second pre-basic molt, which in most birds starts at a year or maybe 8 or 10 months of age. But it's been pulled forward in hummingbirds because they have such a short lifespan that they do everything rapidly. Hummingbirds, their brains must go a million miles an hour. I wish I could be a hummingbird for a little bit and zoom around and see how quickly they think about things, but everything's fast. So I think that they have pulled that second pre-basic molt forward, and so that's what it is. But then, as was documented in ruby-throated, and then we documented it in rufous, and it turns out all of the migratory North American hummingbirds have a pre-alternate molt in the adult cycle as well, and it can be a few feathers. Supposedly in ruby-throated, it involves a gorget as well. Male ruby-throated replace the gorget twice a year. That's unique as far as I know. But so So then, it does fit the simple alternate strategy if you look at it that way. There's one molt in the first cycle, the preformative, then it goes into the second pre-basic molt, so it enters its second cycle, and then it has pre-alternate molts afterwards. So that's what the definition of simple alternate strategy is, and that's why personally I think that's what happened. So I included it as an SAS.
Great. Let's see. So Cesar wrote, I think maybe, do we have any evidence of genes related to molts and different strategies so we can have some help understanding molt in that area?
Not really. Again, the study of mold is pretty lagging behind a lot of other studies. I don't think it's going to result in much, though. All of the examples I've been using, like black-bellied plover and golden plovers, and a lot of other birds where house finches, for instance, the preformative molt can be absent in some, and late hatching birds, and complete in others that hatched early. So there's just too much variation, I think, within molt strategies to imagine that there's a genetic component. However, and this is another big exciting thing that I like to think about, the sequence with which feathers are replaced does seem fixed, evolutionarily fixed. So most birds start with P1, inner primary, and molt right on out. And when you get birds that don't do that, like falcons start with the middle P4, 5 and go out like that. All falcons do that. Every single species within Falconidae does that molt strategy, which differs. So you have to think that that molt strategy evolved early and has been evolutionary fixed within Falconidae. And then not only that, but in a paper I did a few years ago, I showed that the only other group that does that mold is what? Parrots, Cetacidae, cetaciforms. So, and then all parrots do that too. So all parrots and all falcons start with P4 or 5 and molt like that, unlike most birds that start with P1 and just go like that. So what does that mean? That means that, and then of course, right then the paper comes out linking parrots and falcons evolutionarily. So it's like, aha, of course, the ancestor to both parrots and falcons had that molt strategy, and it's been retained through both lineages of both families. So that's kind of cool. And there's other examples you see where birds within families or orders have retained a unique molt sequence strategy. So I would say if there's any way to do genetics and learn something about molt through that, it would be applying genetics to things like the molt sequence of the primaries, or whether or not they have 11 primaries or 10 or 9. That there seems to be a evolutionary component to that. Flamingos and grebes both had 11 primaries, and we all thought, oh, that's kind of cool. What about that? And then all of a sudden, here we go. Grebes and flamingos are thought to be each other's closest relatives. So, boom, there it is again. You got 11 primaries, and some ancestral bird had developed an 11th primary, and then it's now fixed throughout both those entire orders. So there's some work to do there, I'd say, between genetics and molt, but not with the strategies like the four strategies I'm talking about, or whether or not they have pre-alternate molts, or how extensive molts are, or the locations of molts. None of that's going to have any sort of fixed evolutionary basis to it.
All right, sorry about that. So our next question, and I'm probably mispronouncing the name, Wenyi asked, what would be the adaptive value of having a complete versus a partial PF, or preformative, I assume? Are birds with complete preformatives dealing with stronger selection forces of some sort? A lot of the birds I work with in subtropical forests of China seem to have complete PFs based on skull pneumatization data. Would love to chat about this more.
Yeah, and that's true of tropical birds in the Americas, but not all of them. You know, the Johnson and Wolf book I mentioned, you go through that, and even within families, there'll be ones that do and don't have complete molts. And again, I think what you answered it by saying there is some sort of adaptive reason for it. So, a couple of things, I guess, if we look at North American or North temperate systems, what do we have? We have snow bunting, we have Eurasian starling, we have, or European starling, we have wren tit and bush tit. So these are sort of like exceptions up here. And so we would look at those and go, well, why do those species have complete preformative molts? But most birds up here don't. And it's kind of hard to find some overall thing. And I would say it's probably complicated. Starlings maybe maybe they one factor would be if we're going to have a complete molt, we can produce weak juvenile feathers. So maybe in some of these, they really need to get out of the nest quickly. And so they really develop weak feathers, including the flight feathers. And then that's turned into, and then for some reason, maybe food resources are healthy for those species, then they can have a complete preformative molt. And that probably is the case for a lot of tropical birds because they're not under any time constraints. Again, northern birds have the winter that's facing them, and so they don't often have a lot of time to do a complete molt after leaving, even after leaving the nest. So that would be a reason why a lot of northern and probably Australian species have partial molts, preformative molts, whereas more tropical species might have complete molts because there's less constraint on them. Food resources might be fairly predictable and available. And so they may have tended to go to a strategy to produce weaker juvenile feathers to get out of the nest quicker and then having a complete molt rather than stronger, having the molt be partial, developing stronger juvenile feathers. And again, you look at woodpeckers, cavity nesters, raptors, burrow nesters, all tend to have less complete preformative molts. And that's because they can actually grow stronger feathers in the nest because they're not under the predation pressure there. I think that's the best way I can answer that. But it's fun stuff. And you can probably look at it within families and measure a bunch of natural history variables and then maybe answer those kind of questions more rigorously than I am here.
It looks like that might be the end of our questions. Oh wait, let me look.
I just saw one. Could I clarify SAS?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
All
Okay.
right. Yeah. So no. No, I don't know. It just basically means what it is. There's one molt in the first cycle, and that's the big difference. It's birds with pre-alternate molts in the adult cycle. They'd only have one molt in the first cycle. And so what that molt is, why it's there, in birds that later have pre-alternate molts is, there's a lot of reasons why it might be there. Um, and originally Howell et al., maybe this is the question, automatically called that first cycle molt pre-alternate. They assumed it was not preformative, it was pre-alternate. But that wasn't right because you have to, looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint, it could have evolved from preformative molt just as easily as it could have evolved from a pre-alternate molt. So to simplify it, we just count the number of molts. There's one molt in the first cycle and then an additional inserted molt in adult cycles, and that's how we define SAS. But of course, in particular, that strategy shouldn't be viewed as anything evolutionarily significant on its own, just because of the different ways in which it can evolve to be like that. And again, I think merging of the two molts is probably what happens in a lot of the cases where they had, like especially the alcids and gulls, there was a complex alternate strategy to begin with, and then in that first cycle they ended up merging the molts into one because they really didn't need to invest time and energy into replacing the feathers twice. So best I can do.
Great. So I think that is it. And I just want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon, or yeah, it's afternoon where all of us are, I think. Yeah, thanks for being with us. Thanks, Peter, for a great webinar and all the great information.
Thanks everyone for attending. I obviously like to talk about this stuff, so so I'm glad you came and listened.